That. I just had the fun time of giving this same talk to the docs. They liked it. So that was good. And I am going to do what I like to do with patients. I am not going to insult your intelligence. I am going to use the doctor slides a lot. I've knocked a couple of the real busy ones out. But I don't want to bring this down too low. I think most of you guys are well read. You read everything you can, and it's more interesting if you get the real stuff and not the juiced down version, okay? So if you don't mind, but you can ask questions, and I will define my terms if I get going a little too techy for you, okay? So, chronic fatigue syndrome. One of the issues researchers have had with chronic fatigue syndrome is our case definition. And we keep reinventing our case definition, and we keep making it up. We don't really use a lot of science when we make our case definition, and then we all, quibble around for a little while because there's no science in this case definition. There's a group of people like me and a bunch of other people see a lot of patients saying these are important symptoms. But we are making every effort to develop what they call an empiric case definition, one that's derived from science rather than a committee. But this is a committee case definition, and it is our current one, and it has a problem. First, it has a problem for us, the researchers, because it lumps everybody together and doesn't subgroup people into their possible subgroups, okay? It has a problem for you because we made this up without science, and sometimes it interferes with your disability determinations because your doctors use our research case definition since we don't have a clinical case definition per se, and we didn't design this for you. We designed it so that we would be doing good science, and that's a problem. And we are aware of it. In fact, a group came together in Canada, and this was published just last year. This is an international case definition. It's a clinical case definition. And it was designed for two different reasons. Oh, shoot. Okay, I get it. I'm techie here. It was designed partly to try to teach doctors to stop thinking about this as a fatigue illness only, to think about the complicated nature of this illness. So we made some sections where we had to make the doctors think about the autonomic nervous system, the part that regulates your blood pressure and breathing rate and gut motility and things like that. And the neuroendocrine part, the hormone part, and the immune part, the inflammatory part. So with this case definition, it's just a fantastic teaching tool when I'm talking to primary care doctors and say, yes, they have fatigue, and yes, it gets worse when they exercise, and yes, they have non-restorative sleep, and most of them have a tremendous amount of pain, and they have cognitive complaints. And by the way, they also have symptoms of immune, autonomic, and neuroendocrine. So it's a nice case definition. We're trying to get it more in use clinically. Another problem with our case definition from a research point of view is that there's subgroups of chronic fatigue, and we don't know if they look like this or if they look like this. And so we're trying to figure that out. But we have done a lot of work in the last few years, and we know this is really important, and I think most of the investigators are paying a lot of attention to subgrouping. Ultimately, that's good for you, because if I can define you by the real mediators that make you personally sick, I'm far more likely to pick an intervention that works than lumping you with all the other chronic fatigue patients and picking some generic vanilla chronic fatigue remedy that might come out but not be good for you. So we're trying to get good clinical markers and good laboratory markers of what the subgroups might be, so that when we do our clinical intervention studies, we do them on the group that seems like it's right for. We have much more likelihood of being successful, and you're much more likely to reap good rewards from that kind of approach. Part of our problem with chronic fatigue syndrome is that it encompasses other illnesses, and certainly a lot of patients with chronic fatigue syndrome that also have fibromyalgia. That's not always the reverse, but about 60% of chronic fatigue patients would meet the case definition for fibromyalgia, and which is strictly a physical exam case definition of pushing on all those tender points and counting how many hurt. If you get up to 11, you have it. So that's fibromyalgia. But it's important to us because pain is sometimes the overwhelming symptom, and we tend to think of it as fatigue. So it's important the doctors know what is your chief complaint? What's really bugging you? I find cognitive dysfunction is often the chief complaint. Over and above the pain, over and above the fatigue, over and above everything else, people would like to be able to think clearly again, and that makes a lot of sense. There's other overlapping illnesses. A very large $8 million study done on Gulf War vets where we brought them in for 3 days, and their spouse, and their kids that were born post-Gulf War, and did this huge and elaborate evaluation, very intense evaluation. And all we found out of that $8 million study, but a really important finding, was a 16-fold increased risk of chronic fatigue syndrome in Gulf War vets. So that was a very important study. Epidemiology. This is important because it's changing too, a lot of new data coming out. And every time a new study comes out, it's showing how much more frequent this illness is than we thought before, which is good. We crossed that line about 8 years ago where it was bad. It was good for you back in the day when we thought it was an orphan drug illness. If there's less than 50,000 of you in the country, then we could fast track your drugs, which would have been great. But unfortunately, there's 800,000 of you, so we're not allowed to use the orphan drug criteria. On the other hand, drug companies are way more interested in a market of 800,000 than they are in a market of 50,000. So there's good and bad with that news. The good news is that the pharmaceutical companies are actually paying attention. This is bad news. Of all those cases, in a very well done set of studies, one in Chicago, one in Wichita, one by the CDC, and one by Lenny Jason, 80 to 85% of these patients are not diagnosed yet. That's terribly important. That means we as educators have done a very bad job at educating, and our colleagues have been resistant to being educated. Another important finding in Dr. Jason's study in Chicago is our bias. If 15% of our patients are diagnosed, who are they? They are upper middle class, insured, mostly white women, which was what you heard out there, the yuppie flu, right? Whatever that was. But that is a poor reflection of what's true. You can see that there's a 3-fold risk if you're Latino, almost a 2-fold risk if you're African American over being white. Women are more likely to have this disease than men, quite a bit more. But our biases reflect our healthcare and social structure. And I think that we need to own that fact and get on that. There's another important thing that came out just this last year. This is from Bill Reeves at the meeting we had in Wichita, our biannual research meeting. First was his big study in Wichita, which showed severity of illness scores in chronic fatigue syndrome were equal or even worse than congestive heart failure, equal or even worse than COPD, chronic obstructive emphysema, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. That people that are impacted by this illness can stop working. I think he said 25% are on disability. And that results in a $9 billion loss in productivity. Women, of course, more than men because more women have it. And that this amounts to an average household income loss of 50%. So the stress of having this illness on a household, I see all the nodding. I'm preaching to the choir here. But hello, choir. It hurts to be broke. So those of you that have been fighting with the secondary gain issues that are often thrown at you in your disability hearings about how much you're trying to cheat the system by trying to live off of practically nothing while you feel awful, there is some data to support you in your litigation here. Attitudes of docs. Docs, as a whole, don't do this very well. Thus, there's 85% undiagnosed. 44% of these primary care docs in this study did not feel confident that they could make the diagnosis. And 41% said they didn't know how to treat. Actually, that's better than it used to be. And that's saying that maybe half think they could do it, which is kind of amazing. But they're far more likely to be able to do this or feel they can if they know somebody personally, a family friend or a family member that has chronic fatigue syndrome. So the conclusion of that is that we educators need to be better educators. It's a terribly important thing. There's been a series of papers saying, what's in a name matters. Well, this particular paper, which came out 2 weeks ago, aren't I on top of things here? I was doing some of these slides in the airplane. I have to say that. So they're very up to date. You wanted a research update? By God, you got the update to the day. So anyway, patients were more likely to be called myalgic encephalitis or chronic fatigue syndrome if they were more severely ill. Even if they made the case definition of chronic fatigue syndrome, if they were less ill, they were more likely to be called fibromyalgia. And if they were ill for not a very long time, if they've been ill for less than a couple of years, they were more often going to be called a post-viral syndrome rather than chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalitis. So doctors have a bias in the label they apply when they apply the label. So that's kind of interesting. Lenny Jason's done a whole series of lovely papers, published papers, showing how derogatory the chronic fatigue syndrome label is, and how a doctor takes myalgic encephalitis far more seriously as a real medical illness over the label of chronic fatigue syndrome, which caused a number of us to spend 3 long, tedious years on a working group trying to get the name changed. And while we haven't been successful yet, I can say that our enthusiasm has not lagged. We're just up against a lot of barriers. So, but hopefully we'll get there someday. It means I'll have to change my stationery again. But that's okay. I'll do that. So we're talking about what the pathogenesis then of this illness that you suffer from might be. And this is sort of the general idea. Do patients have a genetic predisposition? And the answer is genes do matter. They really do. Another question, what could trigger this event? And we have some data to suggest that at least some of the time an acute viral syndrome that's really immunologically powerful, like Epstein-Barr or CMV or one of those types of viruses, can kick it off. What are the mediators of the illness that keep you sick all these years? And I have a lot of stuff on that, and the health outcome we call chronic fatigue syndrome or recovery. The genetic data goes like this. In Miami, we did a nice study. We looked at 112 people against 5,000 controls and said, people with chronic fatigue syndrome are more likely to have these particular genetic patterns, DR4, DR3, DQ3. These are genetic patterns that are often associated at about the same rate with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's syndrome, and diabetes. The same exact genetic patterns that increase your risk for those are the genetic patterns that we saw in our cohort of chronic fatigue patients. So it was kind of interesting. It made us sort of think, don't completely sell the autoimmune idea down the road, because these are kind of autoimmune genes that we were seeing. Nonetheless, we did the study in '92, and I can't tell you this is an autoimmune disease. I haven't any data to support that other than this genetic study. There's also been several twin studies that showed if you were an identical twin, you had about a 50% chance of also being ill. If you were a fraternal twin, a non-identical twin, then the risk was much lower. So genes do matter. So what's the evidence that triggers matter? Well, there's been a couple of studies. Most patients that we see in our biased group, the 15% that can get to a doctor who knows something about this, will say they had an acute onset. 60 to 80% can tell you the day, the time, roughly the week, the viral-like illness that they had at the beginning. But when they did the Wichita study, which was a better design, randomly calling up households throughout this city and reaching something like 70% of the households in this town and then bringing people in for assessment, it was more like 50-50. 50% with an acute onset, 50% with a slow onset. So a number of patients have an acute onset. And there's 2 prospective studies. The way we like to do science is start before you're sick and get you as you develop illness. There are 2 prospective studies that have been attempted to be done. Really difficult in an illness like this to do this work. One in Australia where they try to capture people right after their infectious mononucleosis infection, or one of these 2 infections that are common to Australians in that part of Australia. And one in London, Peter White, who looked at infectious mononucleosis and looked for predictors. What is there about these people that would predict who stayed sick? The Australian study showed immune abnormalities that would affect their antiviral function. That's what they've shown so far. And the British study showed some psychological factors that they believe to be predictors. So those are the 2 prospective studies. More on mediators. That was a trigger. Now we're getting to mediators. When we talk about these mediators, and I do this 3-legged stool a lot, the immune system matters, the endocrine system matters, the brain matters. But I would add the 4th leg if I knew what system to exactly put it under, because I would make it separate and complete. Sleep matters. So as an interventionist, I try to work on sleep. If I can work on either of these things, I do. And neurologic would encompass the autonomic nervous system, the blood pressure control, and that kind of thing. So there's things to be done trying to get at the underpinnings, the cause of the illness itself. As a clinical immunologist, I therefore tell you about immunology first. We're not putting it second or third or fourth because I'm talking and I get to pick. And I'm an immunologist. So, what you want to know about the immune system is that in fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, there's a shift in the cells that regulate immune function to what we call this type 2 pattern. A type 2 pattern makes antibodies happy, make B cells which make antibodies happy. And that's great if you have a bacterial infection. It's not so great in this setting because you don't have a bacterial infection. And when B cells are overly happy, they do overly happy B cell things like allergy, making IgE antibody, autoimmunity, if we could figure out what the antibody might be, and so on. So on one hand, type 2 is bad because you can actually make bad things as a result of being too heavy on the B cell side. On the flip side, when your B cells are being pushed too hard, there's a funny little switch in the immune system that actually down-regulates or quiets down this side, which is your I'd like to get rid of viruses section. The antiviral section, which is the cytotoxic T cells, which are your primary defense against viruses in general, and particularly chronic latent viral infection. Very important. And over here in the sideshow, not exactly attached, is the natural killer cell. The natural killer cell is a cytotoxic cell that evolved first. It was like with sharks and dinosaurs, there were NK cells. And that was the first immune system cell. And all of this evolved from that cell line. But it's out there in the wings sort of like your backup system. About 10% of your cells are these cells. And when everything else is not working well, NK cells can make a world of difference. For instance, I have some HIV guys with CD4 counts of 1 that have been around for 10 years. And what makes them different than the other HIV guys is they got really good NK cells. Fantastic NK cells. So NK cells can make a difference. In chronic fatigue syndrome, NK cells work very poorly because the same balances that shove this down are also working on this cell, and it gets shoved down too. So that's the immune imbalance in a nutshell. And there's things that therefore happen. You get in this state of chronic immune activation, making all this stuff you don't eat, including inflammatory cytokines that make you hurt and affect your sleep cycle and other things like that. And then you have functional defects of the cells themselves that would make you more prone to latent viral reactivation. So herpes family viruses come to mind, like HHV6, Epstein-Barr, and so on. So what do we know that's new in the last couple years? I sort of said that to you guys a few years ago. Any of you that were here and took notes, you'll find that page. But what's new is this. This is very interesting. We didn't know, we've been looking for a long time for complement as a mediator of this illness because you all hurt a lot and complement causes a lot of inflammation and pain, but no one ever found it. So someone did a study, Jim Jones actually, post-exercise to see what happens post-exercise, and that's when the complement activates. So we were measuring it at the wrong time. And then there was a confirmatory study by the CDC group that actually looked for the genes that code for complement and found that they activated post-exercise. So that was very cool. So that would make a lot of sense, and it fits with that whole type 2 cytokine B cell thing, because that's an antibody thing. Yeah? What is complement? Complement is something that helps you remove bacteria from your system by binding to the target, the bacteria, with the help of some antibody, and then causing this huge inflammatory thing right there. Okay? And it's why complement's the main mediator in rheumatoid arthritis or the big joint diseases. So it's not a friendly camper, and it could, be a nice target for treatment, particularly for post-exertional relapse treatment. So that's kind of exciting stuff. Everything else here is actually stuff we sort of already knew. The worse your NK cells behave, the worse your severity of illness is. That was an important thing. And there's some more stuff about cytokines behaving badly. This one I threw up just because I talk so much about lymphocytes all the time, but your immune system's actually got a lot of cells in it, and half the cells in your immune system are these guys, these neutrophils that are your antibacterial sort of scavenger guys that go out hunting for bacteria. And apoptosis is a science word for death. What it means is these cells die off very quickly and have to be replaced very quickly, and the immune system's in this very big state of turnover. Clinically, that makes a difference because you guys use up a lot more nutrients, particularly the micronutrients you need to make cells. So minerals, women are so mineral deficient. And men, for some reason, a little gender difference, tend to use up their B vitamins more rapidly. All these are very important in having the stuff you need to make fresh and new cells. So it's important to have a good, healthy diet. It's also important to take some reasonable supplements, nutritional supplements that have minerals, and have a really good whopping dose of B vitamins, because that helps you keep up with losses. I put up this slide to cue you that if I get done on time, and I don't even know what on time is now because we started late. Someone could tell me that. What's my target minute? Anyway, if I get done on time, I'm going to show you the cool way they do these gene studies, because this is new technology, and actually chronic fatigue syndrome is one of the first diseases it's being applied to. And I actually fussed about this some years ago because it was too new a technology to be sure it was going to help. And when I heard the CDC was dumping millions of dollars down this pot, I thought, oh no. But oh, they're turning up some cool stuff. I mean, it was a really wonderful investment. And I was wrong, and that's okay. I can deal with it. Because we're really learning a lot of exciting stuff. And it's a different way of looking at things. Instead of knowing what you're looking for, instead, we know what the human genome is. We know every gene, practically the entire genome now, thanks to the Human Genome Project, and what it codes for. And we have these little slides that have 40,000 different genes and little tiny dots on the slide, and then we can take the RNA from the cell or the DNA from the cell and tag it to this slide and read the slide and say what genes you're currently upregulating, making stuff, or downregulating, not making stuff. And then compare that to the normals. And that's what this incredibly expensive study does, is that. And you didn't have to know what you were looking for first. In science, we call this a fishing expedition. And you never get funded when you do fishing expeditions. It's against the rules. Unless you're the CDC and you don't have to go through the same groups I have to go through. And it turned out really cool because they went fishing, and guess what? They found the genes we were talking about all along, which is very cool. And they found some new exciting genes that might give us new markers and new avenues of treatment. So there's some pretty cool stuff. This particular slide, though, was to remind me to tell you that, oops, did I do that? To remind me to tell you that it also broke the chronic fatigue population into two groups, which is real important. Because when we lump you, we're not making progress. When we split you into appropriate subgroups and better understand each subgroup, we're making serious progress. And this grouped people into a sort of a hypometabolic group where the cells at the cell level is not functioning quite up to speed at the cell level. Okay? And then another group that at the cell level was overactivated and depleted in its immune, the things it needs to keep up with immune losses. It was very cool. Good study. Another possible mediator is a chronic viral infection. And a chronic viral infection that's most bandied about is HHV6 virus. It's because we bandied about EBV until we couldn't really prove it. And this HHV6 turned out to be more credible as a target virus to look at. And in a series of studies, historically, anywhere from 54 to 79% of patients over time were actually making virus. So we could see in their bloodstream virus, not antibody to the virus, but the virus. Okay, so that was interesting. It doesn't mean it's causing disease. It could be that a lot of people express this virus. This is one of those latent viruses we carry for the rest of our lives, all of us. But it turns out when we compare you to normal, you have more of this virus than normal, so maybe it is important. I often say, though, be careful aiming at this virus because it's actually could be simply a reflection of your ability to contain latent viruses in general. And it might be some other virus that we haven't named yet. And this virus is, saying, hey, there's a problem with the immune system. I'm letting some virus out. But it could be HHV 12 or 18 or some virus we haven't discovered yet. That might be a more important virus. So it's exciting, and there's some antiviral treatments that are underway, some clinical trials. Probably the most exciting study is Dan Peterson's study in Tahoe, who's looking in the spinal fluid for the virus. And when he sees the virus in the spinal fluid, he treats this infection with really serious antivirals. And he's had some clinical responses going after that. I haven't heard his latest data. But he's here, so trap him and ask him. He's over there in the doctor's land. I tried to get it out of him at lunchtime, but still don't know. He's so excited about other stuff right now, but I can't quite nail him down on that one. This is what I'm excited about. This guy, Ron Glaser, is a fantastic guy. I've been trying to get him in our field for a long time. He's a very famous immunologist and virologist. And he's got this theory that it's not so important that you make a whole virus. Now, that's kind of radical in science because if you might remember the Cox postulates. Remember that in high school? You have to prove something's there by finding it, growing it, injecting it in someone else, and making them equally sick. That's Cox postulate, right? Of course, we don't do that in people. Those are animal studies. And we don't have an animal model in chronic fatigue syndrome, so we can't do a Cox postulate kind of study. But Dr. Glaser said, hey, what if you don't have to make a whole virus? What if what matters is that the virus DNA got into your DNA and started teaching your DNA to code for some stuff that's screwing you up? And it could be screwing you up because it's making little bits and pieces of incomplete virus that are antigenic and the immune system sees it and gets all excited. Or it could be something that changes the metabolism of the cell by contributing some DNA that regulate that cell. And that's kind of exciting because he's a cancer virologist and he's been trying to play this theme out there are some cancers that are caused by viruses. And he's a guy that's an expert in that field. And that's sort of trending that way in that field right now. So he's saying, yeah, DNA that viruses have might actually matter, and maybe that's a reasonable target. So that's pretty exciting and very new stuff. And then this thing, poor Marvin Lerner has been the butt of a lot of jokes because he came out, unfortunately, to the infectious disease group with his first paper, which is really the wrong audience for chronic fatigue syndrome first paper, I can tell you that. But he bravely went to the ID conference and said, there's an infection in the heart. And the ID guys said, no, there's not. And they really gave him a hard time. But he kept at it, and he said, well, look at this. When we find in our patients, when we do cardiac muscle biopsy, which is a pretty amazing test, on the rare occasion when we do that, we do find virus. So we think it's there. And then he went back and came up with some models that also came around incomplete viral expression, that we might not see the whole virus, but we see viral stuff there. And that it's causing a local inflammatory reaction and that there's decreased cardiac motility. He's done some nice studies to show that. And there's another group, two other groups, Peckerman and our group, that have also showed this decreased cardiac motility in chronic fatigue syndrome. So moving to another area, endocrine. HPA, you hear this word bandied about because we can't talk in whole and complete sentences in medicine. Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary what to do. The pituitary, in turn, tells all of the endocrine glands that are outside the brain whether or not to make stuff or stop making stuff. That's basically nuts and bolts of endocrinology. See? I can pass the boards tomorrow. Yes, sure. Is there any endocrinologists in the room? Oh dear. I've oversimplified the field, but that's the nuts and bolts. And what we find in chronic fatigue syndrome is that there's a problem at the level of the hypothalamus, there's a problem at the level of the pituitary, and there's a problem at the level of the adrenal gland. All three areas are mildly off. Not so severe that there's a flamin, what would be Addison's disease in the endocrine term, because there's so little cortisol. But there's less cortisol than there should be. And there's less, when you do the stimulation tests, responses to the appropriate stimulations. So that's the kind of work that's been going on. And there's a lot of data out there. This is my favorite study. It was done in fibromyalgia. And I put it on the slides because these poor endocrinologists that do this work are often criticized in our field, like the ID guys, to say that they use too small a sample of subjects, that they've only studied 18 or 20 or whatever. And so this Dr. Bennett, who I've now finally met, I've been using this slide for a lot of time because I just admire the study so much. I'm sure what happened was he got fed up. He'd been at one meeting too many where someone jumped up and said, but Dr. Bennett, you only looked at 48, you know? He said, okay. And he went out and did 500, which is a ridiculous number in science. You don't ever do 500 of anything. He did 500 patients, and he found this hypothalamic dysfunction and the lower expression of growth hormone. In the past couple of years, there's been a lot of confirmatory papers showing that it's the H to P and the A, hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal. That's always been a little controversy in our group, in our field, but I think that this is pretty well defined now. There's also been some papers looking at abnormal serotonin function. That would be very interesting if that proves to be true. DHEA, which is sort of the mother hormone from which all the steroid-based hormones like testosterone and, well, a bunch of stuff come out of DHEA. And then there's some nice studies that take this inflammatory cytokine, IL-6, and correlate it with a low cortisol, suggesting that the IL-6 itself is downregulating this HPA axis. That's pretty interesting stuff. The autonomic nervous system. Do you remember that fight or flight versus rest and recuperate, right? I mean, some people might say you guys are in the rest and recuperate stuck zone, right? But actually you're not. You're jumping up and down. The usual sympathetic parasympathetic balance is a very subtle thing where this little balancing act goes like this, up and down. Sympathetic goes up and the parasympathetic says, okay, I'll fix that, and puts it back. It's a little up, down, very minor. With chronic fatigue syndrome, it's like, whoo, 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 whoo. Thus you get that sudden flushing, tachycardia, that sort of anxiety attack sensation, sympathetic, all right? Then you get a drop in your blood pressure and you feel cognitively fogged all of a sudden, parasympathetic overflow. That's the basic triggers, mechanisms behind that. Very interesting stuff, a lot of work being done and a lot of therapy being done quite effectively to try to get this part of it right. There's even some people who say this is so common, you can make the diagnosis on it, that this might be our first really good, highly sensitive marker for chronic fatigue syndrome. I don't know if that'll take, but the paper was pretty strong and their data was pretty impressive. So we'll see what happens next year on that. This is done with tilt table testing. Has anyone here had a tilt table test? Would anyone who had one ever want to have one again? They're pretty miserable, right? And that's the problem with tilt table testing. They're expensive and they're miserable, but they're objective data that proves there's something wrong. They objectively tell the doctor what to do about it. So there's good reasons to order one, but they almost always cause a chronic fatigue syndrome relapse post a tilt. Just like if you overexerted, you'd have a relapse. Usually worse than that relapse. Usually a 3 or 4 or 5 day crummy relapse. So they're kind of hard to talk your patient into, I can tell you that. And when you do a research study that involves 2, let me tell you how hard that is to recruit. Because we're doing that study, and it's really hard. But nonetheless, it's a really important study. Sometimes we can get at this information just by doing blood pressure logs and having you guys keep a flat and upright and a sudden cognitive fog measure and show me whether or not you have a big variability in your normal blood pressure. And that sometimes will convince me well enough. But sometimes I actually need the tilt to tell me what drug to use to try to make this all better, or at least more better. It's important. Another thing that's autonomic is gastric emptying. A lot of you suffer from irritable bowel. Sympathetic, you know, your immune system, your autonomic nervous system suddenly goes, stop doing that. You need to go somewhere right now. Run, run, run. You know, it's the fight or flight thing. Shut your bowel down. And then, you know, you're done with that little sympathetic surge. Your parasympathetic comes rushing in and says, whoa, hypermodal, hypermodal, hypermodal. And then you're in the bathroom with diarrhea. And that's irritable bowel in a nutshell. Well, at the upper end of your gut, you have a stomach. And a lot of you might notice that you have some reflux disorders. There's been this study just out this last year that showed the gastric emptying problems, that you just take a lot longer to empty your stomach. The things stay there and don't empty, and you're more prone to reflux. And that's another autonomic dysfunction. So there's different ways to look at this. There's been a lot of different studies to do that. And then it's something actually treatable. So that's an important thing. Speaking of treatable things, sleep physiology. I always say if there's one thing you can get right in a patient and they'll be grateful to you forever, short of birthing your first child and having some doctor hand it to you as if they did the work. You know, didn't you feel grateful? You did? No, I did that. No, yeah, that was my job. Anyway, sometimes a doc can actually help you with your sleep. And when that happens, the quality of your life's a lot better. If you get restorative sleep, I mean, you can think this through. If you get one good night's sleep, don't you have a much better next day? And then uniformly, every one of you goes out and does way too much and crashes, right? But that's your problem. Because you are stubborn people. But if you can have that good night's sleep reliably for 2 or 3 weeks, what would it do to your life? You know? And that is so important. So I don't give up on sleep. I fail a lot in helping my patients with sleep, but I keep trying, because sometimes I can find the right button. Usually the right button is stage 4 sleep. If I can get someone into stage 4, which, by the way, is when your hypothalamus resets for the night, decides how much cortisol you get the next day. Oh, by the way, it regulates your pain cycle. All this is happening during stage 4 sleep, okay? And you don't get any. What do you think the consequence of that is? I mean, that's just so important. If we can reestablish circadian rhythm, you've done a world of good. So there are medications that help sleep. You have workshops on sleep in this symposium. At least the doctors are over there learning all about it, which is really good for you. Your docs are over there right now with sleep experts, which is good. But there are some drugs that are newly out that are stage 4 inducers. And there are a number of drugs that are stage 4 stealers that many patients are on, particularly the Valium derivative drugs. So you have to be very careful with some of the drugs that come out of the field of diazepam. Muscle. Does anyone know how much time I have? Pardon? 5 more minutes? Is anyone in charge? Because I started really late. Because I don't know whether or not I should do the CDC stuff or not. Okay. Because I can skip that whole CDC spot and catch you up. Okay. All right. I'll go till 3. All right. Very good. Anyway, muscle, there's been some studies to show that muscle's a problem. This is not a big surprise since I told you the CDC is doing this work to show you that cells are a problem. Of course, muscle's yet another cell. And there was a study done that I don't have up here by Chuck Blapp, where he took a whole group of patients and put them on a treadmill for 20 minutes, and they all collapsed and went home and had chronic fatigue syndrome relapse for the next 3 or 4 days, right? So he did what you knew would happen. Then he brought the patients back, and he said, okay, I want you to do this again, but only for 5 minutes, and I want you to lie down for 5. And then up for 5, down for 5, up 5, down, and so on. And they could go and go and go and go. Now, why would that be? There's 2 possibilities. One would be that they never had a blood pressure dip because they were not upright long enough to drop their pressure. His blood pressure drops tend to be 15, 20, 30 minutes into doing something. So it could be that he never got the autonomic trigger. Or it could be that he needed to perfuse these muscles for 5 minutes, get the toxins out of there before they could get up and go again. It changed my way of thinking about exercise physiology because I've been encouraging my patients to start at 2 minutes and go to 3 and go from 3 to 4 and then try to get yourself up to 15 or 20 minutes. And instead what I've found is, since the Madison meeting, I've been saying do 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off. You know, go swimming. It's normal behavior by a pool to lie up sorry for 5 minutes after you did something. So, or go dancing. That's a really good one because dances are just about 5 minutes long. And then go lay up sorry for don't do every dance, do every other. So that's not a bad way. And perfuse a bit because they can tolerate exercise a lot more. And the other thing I found with my patients with exercise is that any prone exercise is much better tolerated than upright because this requires a consistent blood pressure. And this does not. You're not inducing any of those stretch receptors to do all their crazy trigger things this way. So mats, swimming, recumbent bicycle, there are lots of recumbent exercises that can be done and be done very well, and they're much better tolerated. I also encourage my patients who are prone to join gyms and then make me write letters saying why they can't go to the gym anymore, that they should buy the tapes if they're going to do this. Say Pilates for mats, right? And if you can't do the 30-minute tape, that's fine because you can put a tape on pause and come back. But if by the end of the day you did the whole tape, then you did 30 minutes of Pilates. Say, hey, that's pretty cool. That's more than I did for sure in the last, say, 5 years. So that's really good. So that's a good thing to do. So there's different tricks that you can use to help yourself. The sleep physiology trick, you're going to have a talk about this, but the idea is to stay, remember Pavlov, you know, and how important conditioning is. Go to bed the same time every night, you know, and have a sort of a bedtime behavior. One of the triggers for sleep is a 1 degree drop in body temperature. So if you take a hot bath before you go to bed, you raise your temperature and then drop it, you're going to get sleepy right after the bath. Serotonin's also released after a carb snack. So it wasn't the milk and cookies, it was the cookies, okay? That caused that little serotonin surge and you get sleepy. So there's things you can do. The other thing doctors don't hear real well is it's usually not falling asleep that's the issue, it's the staying asleep that's the issue. And what is waking you up? You need to tell your doctor what that is. Is it pain? Is it restless leg? Do you have to pee every 2 hours? What's doing that? Because there are treatments for each and every one of those things that might be effective for you. It's terribly important to have that discussion. I did all that. And I did all that. Cool. I'm debating. I'm going to slide into one quick, I'm going to jump over things and just show you a pretty slide. Let's see if I can do it. Okay, this is 30,000 genes on a slide. And the slide's the size of a slide. It's a small little thing. And this is that gene study I was telling you about, where they can do comparative case control comparisons and look at the genes that are being expressed. And when they do that, they can ask a lot of different questions. One of them is this question: are there differences between groups of chronic fatigue patients? And I told you that they found that the gradual onset patients were actually different than the sudden onset patients, and the kinds of genes that were either overexpressed or underexpressed, and that the patterns made sense. These gradual onset patients tend to be hypometabolic, and the genes that are controlling the metabolism rate within a single cell were being underexpressed. Whereas the sudden onset patients tend to be more inflammatory, and they were overexpressing the genes that control the cytokines I talked about, and the stuff the cell needs to control viral infection. So that was kind of cool. And I'm not going to make you think about that. That was a complicated slide. I made the doctors go through that slide. They made me leave. So this is very exciting stuff. This is the CDC research team that's doing this. And they can distinguish a well person from a sick person, and they can distinguish within sick chronic fatigues 2 different subpopulations based on these gene arrays. But one of the most important things they're saying is, hey, it's not one gene and it's not one system. What's wrong with chronic fatigue patients is complicated. It's metabolic, it's endocrine, it's immune. I mean, all these things came true with the endocrine, with the gene array patterns. And that you need this combination of things that makes you sick. So in essence, it means that we've all been right, all of us that have been looking through different doors at chronic fatigue syndrome. And that this is a way to integrate the whole thing into a cell model. So we're thinking at the level of a cell, hey, look at this. This is very interesting. At the level of the mitochondria, at the level of the cell wall, at the level of the things the cell wall is supposed to do. We're better understanding all of this now. Very new. This is hot off the, this is 2 weeks old, this data. This is really very hot off the press kind of stuff. So I'm going to end with these 2 slides. This is a pediatric advances slide. Who here has kids with chronic fatigue syndrome? Okay, very good. The kids are always sort of last in line in research, mostly because a lot of research is done in adults because they can make an informed consent, you know, and when we're doing particularly intervention studies, you know, you would like an informed consent. This might hurt you. Are you willing to take that risk? And then when they discover that something's sort of working in adults, they'll shift it over, and they understand the risk in adults, they'll shift it over to the kids. So kids usually are second in line for most research studies. But there isn't really the excuse for not understanding the physiology of chronic fatigue syndrome in kids. We have just been very slow getting there. There aren't very many pediatric researchers in this field. Very, very few. But this is what we know that's very recent. Oops, come back, come back. Yeah. This is very recent stuff. Look at that, everything's 2005. This is all very recent. This is HPA axis dysregulation, just exactly like adults, finally confirmed in kids. That has not been happening. So this is good, very important, because it tells us an avenue to potentially intervene. Studies, a very good study that looked at the possibility of a connective tissue disorder that looked like chronic fatigue syndrome but wasn't, showed that this is not a connective tissue disorder, that this is chronic fatigue syndrome in kids. So that's been an argument that's been slowing us down, because the rheumatologist has been saying, no, the kids are different. This is some atypical variant of juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, so this is some atypical variant of whatever. So this is a nice study to put aside some barriers that have been in our way with kids. A nice study on cognitive behavioral therapy in kids that would help, says it helps. As a parent of 3 adolescent girls, cognitive behavioral therapy would help us all. I can tell you. Really, a lot. It should be forced reading. It should be CBT all the way through elementary, middle, and God forbid, yes, please, 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 high school. And then all of us that agree to parents should be forced to go once a week to a group. And we would all be better parents, and our kids wouldn't make us so crazy. But CBT in the setting of illness is wonderful because it gives a kid a sense of control. And you know how out of control adolescents feel anyway. Everything's changing, you know. Their bodies are changing, their friendships are changing, everything's different, and then bam, throw this on top. They have a really rough time. And I think there's never a more important group to offer good support systems and cognitive behavioral types of approaches than an adolescent group. And then there was this very interesting twin study just out. This is a London group that said that the incidence, the frequency of chronic fatigue syndrome in the twins was equal to that of the adult population, which might say we're real wrong about what we've been saying, that this is not common in kids. It could be just as common as it is in adults. And then there's the recovery studies, 2 of them. You missed David Bell speaking to us earlier. He showed in a follow-up study of his kids that 36% of the chronic fatigue syndrome defined kids that were adolescents and now adults had recovered. 46% remained ill at some level, and 18% still remained defined as chronic fatigue. So in general, that was kind of encouraging that the trend was at least towards improvement, and there were some recoveries. In this other study, the Gills study, which had a mean follow-up time of about 4.5 years, if the patient had been diagnosed as chronic fatigue syndrome, if they'd been that ill to begin with, they had 25% complete recovery, 31%, so a little more than half that had gotten better or all the way better, and about 40% that hadn't improved. But if they weren't quite chronic fatigue, if they didn't meet the case definition, say they had 2 or 3 of the 4 symptoms, there's 100% improvement in that group, recovery in that group. So that was encouraging. Very interesting stuff. So I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to close there, I think.